This is a recording from a Sunday meeting of the BC Humanist Association in Vancouver. Humanism is a progressive worldview that, without supernaturalism, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead meaningful, ethical lives capable of adding to the greater good of humanity. To learn more about humanism and to support our work, visit bchumanist.ca and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and be sure to subscribe to the BC Humanist podcast. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of our staff or board of directors.
So I actually have given a talk on this topic before here, about 3 years ago. I don't know if anyone here was present for that talk. This talk is quite different, but I will go through the first part of the presentation. We'll discuss our views. There's an echo. The first part of the talk will give an overview of our views, why myself and my colleague, Dr. Kristen Fiala, we've been collaborating on this project for several years now, why we believe conscientious objection is inappropriate in healthcare. And then the next part of the presentation will talk about what we've been actually doing to try and shift the views out there on conscientious objection and try and actually stop it from being an accepted practice in healthcare. So first of all, what is conscientious objection in reproductive health care? That's what RH stands for. So we define it as the refusal by a healthcare professional to provide a legal medical service or treatment for which they'd normally be responsible, they'd be expected to do it as part of their jobs. But based on their objection to the treatment for personal or religious reasons, they refuse to do it. So the very first law to explicitly allow CO, I call it CO for short, it's easier to say than conscientious objection, was in the UK. And this is, we're talking about like healthcare overall. The very first law was targeted exactly only towards abortion. So the 1967 Abortion Act in the UK. And the US followed shortly after that. Right after Roe v. Wade, they passed an amendment allowing CO. So today, CO is still exercised almost exclusively for abortion, and as well as other reproductive health care, like contraception and sterilization, but primarily it's abortion. And it's only recently that assisted dying has become legal in a few countries, and that's become an issue as well for CO. And I also disagree with that for the same reasons in terms of doctors being able to refuse, at least they should refer. So also, it's often been expanded in many countries to institutions like giving hospitals the right to CO, but of course only individuals can have a conscience that they can exercise. So it's really wrong to do that, because when you expand it to a whole hospital, you're actually violating the consciences of the doctors within that hospital who are pro-choice and who want to do abortions to help their patients. They're being prohibited from doing that. So basically, CO is like a backlash against legal abortion, and we think that allowing CO actually undermines the law and weakens it, and it gives people an excuse to ignore or disobey the law, because you're passing a law allowing abortion in the UK as they did in 1967, but at the same time you're giving people an exemption from the law, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. So basically, CO originally was kind of based on, military CO. We're all familiar with that. In the military, soldiers might conscientiously object to killing, so they object to the draft. But there's no real comparison. We say that killing a living person in war, because you're being forced to by the draft, has nothing to do with stopping the development of a tiny gestational sac, an embryo, or a fetus that only has the potential to become a living person. And also, it's important to say that abortion and contraception actually preserve the health and lives of women, and while those practicing CO are putting women's health and lives at risk. So it's quite the opposite from military CO. And just to illustrate that a bit further, here's a little table that we did up of comparisons between CO in the military and as exercised by healthcare professionals. So soldiers are drafted into compulsory service. They have no choice. Healthcare professionals are applying for their position voluntarily. They're competing for training and jobs. Being a doctor is a very privileged position. Soldiers are powerless. They have to obey orders from their superiors. Doctors are in a position of authority and trust, and they're treating patients who depend on them. Soldiers are conquering and killing for their country, while healthcare professionals are saving patients' lives, improving their health. And when soldiers claim the right of CO, they don't just get off scot-free. They have to justify their stance, usually like appearing in front of a panel and being interrogated for hours. They have to undergo this rigorous review process. They may be punished. Some people have gone to jail in the U.S., I think, during the draft of the Vietnam War, or they have to complete an alternate service when they're serving for the military. But when doctors claim the right to CO, they rarely even have to justify it. They're often protected explicitly by law or policy. Sometimes there's even laws making it against the law to discriminate against doctors who are discriminating against women. They rarely face any discipline. They retain their positions, and they're still being paid for them. And they may benefit because they're escaping abortion stigma, being labeled an abortion provider. So they could be boosting their career and their reputation and even their salaries, because then they can focus on more lucrative pursuits in the medical field, and abortion does not make very much money for doctors. So, basically, healthcare professionals are quite privileged, soldiers are not. And when you allow doctors to exercise CO without any consequence, it just gives them a license to abuse their privilege and authority. So I'm going to introduce a different term here because we actually don't like the term conscientious objection. We think it's a misnomer, and it's not even really what it is. Like, it's been co-opted from the military, but as I've shown you, it's really quite opposite. So it does not represent true freedom of conscience. Instead, it's an unjustified veto of a patient's right to health care. We go so far as to call it negligent refusal to do the job you're hired and paid to do. You're imposing your own personal religious beliefs on another person, a more vulnerable person. Makes it an abuse of trust and authority. And there's an issue of class here as well. The doctors being privileged or using your class privilege to control others in a lesser position. And basically, it's harmful to patients, exercising CO, both psychologically and physically. It's on a continuum. Harm is on a continuum. And even if the doctor refers promptly, there's still a bit of a delay. The woman has to go to another doctor. And often the harms are much worse than that. I think it's a violation of women's human rights. And because most reproductive health care is delivered to women, it amounts to gender discrimination against women. And also LGBTQ people as well. So we call it dishonorable disobedience. And I was just doing, we published an initial article introducing that term back in 2014. And so, I can't say the term has really caught on, but it's getting out there more and more. And if you do a Google search, I did it this morning, there's 688 hits for the term dishonorable disobedience now. So from this point onward, I'm going to call it, instead of CO or conscientious objection, I'm going to call it DD. So when I say DD, I mean CO. Hope that's not too confusing. So I wanted to draw a parallel between, you've probably all heard of Mrs. Betty Bowers. I think she's fantastic. The really satirizes like the sanctimonious Christian with moral superiority. So we've all heard about the huge problems down in the States with they're passing laws basically making it legal for if you're, like Christian who operates a bakery, they want to be able to refuse to bake cakes for gay people, and these cases are in court. And Trump is also, I think, I don't know all the details now, but trying to overturn protections. If you go back to I just want to draw a comparison here between those issues that are happening in the U.S. and laws against abortion and CO against abortion, or DD rather, because I kind of think that the use of DD for abortion, over the last few decades in the U.S., may have sort of set the groundwork, laid the base for it's expanded in the U.S. to a great degree. So so it might be behind this current push to redefine religious freedom as the right to discriminate against others, basically. So it points out this cartoon is pointing out the hypocrisy between the two, but really they're actually the same issue. It's the imposition of religious beliefs on others. So DD is like a boycott. It's an exemption from democratically decided laws. And here we're talking specifically about laws that are designed to protect the civil rights and health of women and minorities in particular. So it's I think it's particularly egregious to be asking for exemptions to human rights laws. That's pretty dangerous. And there's also this principle of public accommodation. The 1964 Civil Rights Act basically said that you can't refuse. You can't refuse, like if you're a racist waiter in a restaurant or a business owner, you can't refuse to serve black people. That's against the law. But that's what they're trying to turn this around now in the U.S. and trying to get rid of public accommodation principles for LGBTQ minorities, and certainly they've been doing it for women already. So Christian and I think that DD violates medical ethics, and these are some of the ways I want to expand on a little bit. So they're choosing by their own volition to work in a helping profession that fulfills the public trust, and in that way it's kind of similar to being a lawyer. Like as a lawyer, you're obligated to help clients, and you may find your client did something really horrible and you really disagree with what he did, but your job is still to defend them, right? And so I think physicians have an obligation to help their patients, and it doesn't really matter whether they don't like the patient or if they're sexist or anti-gay or whatever, or if they for example think it's morally wrong to engage in extreme sports, so they're going to refuse to help people who are injured in accidents. That's ridiculous. So they're bound by laws on negligence and by fiduciary duty to their patients. They've got a duty to provide care to patients without discrimination. This is pretty much in all medical codes of ethics. Patients rely on them for essential health care. They can't go elsewhere. There's actually a monopoly on, medicine. Doctors and other healthcare professionals deliver it, unless you want to go to like a naturopath or a homeopathic doctor. And we're not going to do that. So, and physicians, they know in advance when they're going to medical school, they know full well the kinds of care that they're going to be expected to provide in their practice. So if you're going into primary care to be a family doctor, patients are going to frequently request contraception, maybe even referrals for abortion. And if you're going into obstetrics gynecology, well, many of your patients are going to need help with unplanned pregnancies, and you have an obligation to help them, not turn them away. So DD clashes also with like the idea of patient-centered care and preventive care. Like over the last few decades, our medical system has become more patient-directed. Like doctors are supposed to listen to their patients and respect their rights and so on. And patients have a right to any legal treatment within reason, and the right to refuse treatment and so on. So the whole idea of DD, it undermines standards of care and best practices in medicine, and it actually contradicts the entire purpose of medicine, which is to care for patients. So if you're refusing to treat, you're not caring for patients. So we think it's unethical, DD, because, the anti-choice people would say, well, what about the fetus? But really we think that's that so-called moral concern for zygotes and fetuses is really a false ethical framework. And we have to focus on women. It's hurting women, and women are the patients, the primary patients. It's, I think, well demonstrated now, contraception is basic, essential, life-saving health care that virtually all women of childbearing age will use at some point of their lives. So safe and legal abortion also saves women's lives and health because it prevents death and injury from unsafe, illegal abortions. Oops. Echoes again. There's been some new estimates in terms of the number of maternal deaths from unsafe abortion around the world, so there's some uncertainty, but it's somewhere between 22,000 and 46,000 deaths per year of women from unsafe abortion, mostly in developing countries. So exercising DD, it's a reflection of stigma against women's autonomy and sexuality and reproductive rights. As I explained, the laws are all about the CO laws are all about abortion only, right? It was a reaction to the legalization of abortion. And we see it really as a capitulation to anti-choice views, and there's no benefit to women or society. It's like a vigilante action against the legality of abortion and contraception, and just a backdoor way to deny care despite the law, just to get around the law. And the harms done to women by doctors exercising DD, disrespect, suffering, even death. Some people have died, and I'll talk about that later. They're on the same continuum as the harms of criminalized abortion. So it's really not much different. So there's a couple of really bad assumptions that the exercise of DD rests on. And a lot of people support CO in the field, kind of based on these unquestioned assumptions. And the first one is, well, only a minority of healthcare professionals will actually exercise DD, and there will be others available to perform the service as needed, so they just need to refer and everything will be fine. But actually, DD can easily become very widespread, leaving women without access. And there's some countries in the world, in particular Italy and South Africa, Spain, many countries in South America, where a majority of doctors are objectors. And it just shuts down access almost completely for many women, especially the more marginalized women. Also, abortion stigma itself makes DD an attractive solution. So, like, a lot of people who don't even have, like, if they're not sincerely anti-choice, they're just claiming to be an objector just for convenience, to avoid the stigma, to make sure that they're not hurting their reputation. And as I mentioned earlier, it's an unfair burden on providers who do conscientiously commit to provide abortions. Like in Italy, depending on the region, like somewhere between 70 to 90% of all obstetricians refuse to provide abortions. And then the workload, like the doctors who do provide abortions, ends up that's about all that they can do, and they're overworked. And they're very stigmatized as well, including by their fellow doctors. So the other main assumption that people make was, we'll just pass this law regulating the CO. We're going to require doctors to refer. Everything will be great. But the problem with that is, the assumption is that objectors will limit their exercise of DD as required by a law or policy. But many objectors will refuse to even make referrals. They won't even provide accurate information. I mean, this is often in a lot of policies and laws that you have to provide accurate information. Well, what does that even mean for an anti-choice doctor? An anti-choice doctor thinks accurate information is telling a woman that abortion causes breast cancer. So it's all pretty relative. And the other aspect is, they're supposed to provide care in an emergency. So if there's an emergency, urgent care, there's no other doctor around, well, they have to do the abortion. In fact, some objectors will not only disrespect, mistreat women, refuse to refer, they'll even let them die. And it's also a contradiction in terms, like, allowing CO up to a point and then saying, okay, now you have to do an abortion. Like, you can't pretend to respect doctors' conscience by drawing a line at which they are required to violate it. And it doesn't work. Also, DD, it's usually unregulated, unmonitored by professional bodies, by the government. The requirements for DD, they're routinely ignored or abused with impunity. I mean, how do you even control it? So there's widespread abuse where they try to regulate it. So we think it can be successfully stopped. And it's a huge challenge. We have a long ways to go, but I'm encouraged by some recent progress. And I thought a lot about ways of how it can be done, and obviously it's not going to change overnight. But healthcare professionals can be held more accountable. So for starters, the long-term goal, I think, for Christian and I is just to see conscientious objection just be gradually reduced over time until the point where there's so few objectors in any particular country that it's feasible to just ban it, because it's not going to create an outcry or a problem then. So if you start out by actually screening medical students at the point of entry into medical school, and if they're going to be objectors against abortion, for example, they shouldn't be even allowed to enter the OB/GYN specialty. Existing objectors, they can be assisted to move to another field. They could even be recompensed financially. So we're not talking about forcing doctors to do abortions. That's a red herring. First of all, you can't force a truly anti-choice doctor to do an abortion. But the other thing that we've also recognized too is that there are a percentage of objectors who are just kind of doing it in an uninformed way. And if you give them some education or exposure to patients who need abortion, there's lots of things in continuing education in medicine, called values clarification, like they go through ethics workshops and things like that. And so some doctors can change their mind and start thinking, oh yes, okay, I understand now why I need to provide abortions. So you can convert, so to speak, a number of doctors, which is great, and we should do that as much as possible, but it's not going to work for everyone. There's always going to be a really significant number. I hate to hazard a guess, but I don't know, at least a third to half, maybe more, of doctors who you're just never, ever going to convert. They're always going to remain objectors. So if existing objectors are not willing to sort of move to another field or another area where their objection won't be a problem, then we need to step up enforcement and monitoring and enforcement procedures and make sure, register them and monitor them, maybe have them submit reports or something on their refusals. Maybe, for example, they shouldn't be allowed to work alone in a clinic. They need to have another doctor there who can do referrals or whatnot. There needs to be mechanisms in place to ensure that women can be provided the service. And even things like, maybe paying doctors less, for example, or allowing hospitals to have priority hiring of non-objectors, things like that. In other words, you're just discouraging and putting in place disincentives to object. So you're not stopping them from objecting, but you're just making it harder. And then over time, hopefully that would lower the number of objectors. And I think the key support for doing that, for being able to lower the number of objectors in the country, is strong support for women's rights and equality, because if there's a strong commitment to secularism and gender equality in the country, it's almost like a no-brainer. I mean, of course you're not going to allow CO. Or it's unnecessary, it's unacceptable. Because as we've seen, DD is correlated with abortion stigma, conservatism, religious dogmatism, especially the Catholic Church, and lower status for women. So we shouldn't try to accommodate this ongoing oppression and stigmatization of women under the guise of conscience. So there is 3 countries, and Christian and I have written an article about this with 3 co-authors, one from each of the countries, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland. They don't allow DD. And so they've proven that it's possible to do so. And there's no harmful consequences. They just simply redirect possible objectors into other areas. And there's not that many objectors anyway. In fact, most of the objectors they do have are actually immigrants from other countries in Europe. So it really goes to show that, when you're raised in a sort of gender equality culture, it's not even going to be an issue anymore, this issue of CO. And also, I think it's really a good thing to disallow DD, because that aligns with the global advancement of human rights, and women's rights are human rights. Before I go on to there, I just wanted to mention that one of the objections we often get is, you need to balance, doctors' rights of conscience with patients' right to treatment. And this is the thing we've come across over and over and over again. Like when we're trying to stop it, we're not fighting the anti-choice. We're fighting our own colleagues, other doctors in the field who are trying to protect their right to CO. And people seem to have this assumption, the assumptions I talked about, that the right to conscience is something very important, and we need to respect it, of course. And they're just assuming, they don't question it. Like all the stuff I've ever read, there's no real rationale for respecting the right to conscience, other than, it's a United Nations, it's a human right, and the United Nations, so on. But you can't. There's all these qualifiers, like as I talked about, when you're going into a public health care and helping the public accommodation principle, and you can't be discriminating against people. So any right can be justifiably limited to protect the rights of other people, and this is one of those cases. And so there's organizations and professionals that support DD, and they often confidently state that providers have a right to conscience, that patients have a right to health care. But, I always point out that is actually a contradiction in terms, because if you're giving providers a right to refuse treatment, the patient is not getting treatment. So so which is it? Because we keep pointing out these things are incompatible. And just giving doctors this right to refuse violates the fundamental values and policies of the very medical organizations that espouse CO. And all their noble talk about, physicians' commitment to patient care and interest, evidence-based medicine, comprehensive care, and so on and so on. But as soon as you allow DED, then healthcare is no longer comprehensive. It's no longer based on science and evidence. It's no longer in the patient's best interests. And doctors are no longer committed to any of the above. So once we allow a doctor to bring their religious beliefs into their medical practice, we can't stop even the expansion or abuse of DD because you can't really question the doctor's beliefs or how sincere they are. We just have to accept it. Like a lot of people say, well, we just have to make sure the doctor is sincere in their belief. Well, how do you do that? I mean, you can't put religious beliefs you can't subject them to tests of evidence. Like if someone says, I really, really believe, that Mary was a virgin and or whatever, you have to just accept that belief because beliefs are irrational. And once you allow the imposition of religious beliefs into medical care, how can you stop it? They just want to expand it more and more and more. So that's my colleague, Dr. Kristen Fiala. So as I said, we've been working on this for several years now, and I think what our goals are is that we're trying to shift the terms of the debate and just raise awareness. Because when we first started doing this, there wasn't that much recognition about, it was just the basic assumption that, of course, we have to allow CO, it's a good thing, and maybe there are some harms to patients, but we'll just sort of require doctors to refer, everything will be all right. So we're trying to change this underlying assumption that CO should be respected and valued. We want to change that so that people recognize that it's actually inappropriate and unethical in healthcare. So we're using evidence-based arguments against DD, all the things that I've shown you, and lots of actual cases of women harmed by it, how it's abused, and then encouraging measures to reduce the exercise of DD and the number of objectors with the aim of eventually banning it. So we've been engaging in a lot of just talking to colleagues, trying to persuade them, discussions and debates, often emails, for example. And like one thing I've tried to do, it's hard because there's quite a bit of literature out there, and there's actually been more and more literature on CO in the last few years, which is maybe a good thing. People are recognizing more and more of the harms that it's causing. So when an article is published that has those bad assumptions about CO in it, or otherwise supports DD, I'll often look up the author, write them privately, give them our critiques, and sometimes they respond, sometimes they don't. I might have a little debate with them for a while, but just hoping that this will help shift their thinking. So maybe in their next article they might think about what we said a bit, and it might help. And so sometimes we've been quite successful there, and there was one prominent researcher with IPAS, which is IPAS is global NGO dedicated to ending preventable deaths and disabilities from unsafe abortion. So they're all over the world, and this researcher was in Latin America. We had an email debate going back and forth because I wrote her and critiqued her article, which made this assumption that, oh yes, CO is fine and we can successfully regulate it, yay. So she came around. And this is what she said to me. She said, we were arguing about, how you can't expect objectors to refer. They won't, refer. They'll always never be satisfied. So she says, I see your point, Joyce. I agree when you say that objectors will never be satisfied. They'll always object. After much thinking, I do think that what happens in reproductive health care is something that is named as CO opportunistically, but in fact is not. This is why I'm now saying that this is a false dilemma, health providers' right to CO versus women's human rights. And as I mentioned, in Latin America, it's particularly bad. That little map shows the laws about abortion. In many countries, it's completely prohibited or just allowed to preserve health, or maybe on socioeconomic grounds, but there's a lot of objectors in these countries. So even where it's allowed legally, women may not be able to access it because of DD. So we have a website. It's called conscientious-objection.info. And we'll use that term because it's the most widely understood and known term. So the left side shows some of the elements on the website, and a lot of it is just kind of summarizes some parts of our articles. And we've managed to publish quite a list of publications. The one on the top is our first one from 2014, where we first coined that term, dishonorable disobedience. And there's actually a list of 12. About half of them have been published in scientific journals, which is great. I'm really happy about that because I don't even have a university degree, and here I am publishing in scientific journals. Yay! Although I sometimes notice that when people are citing us or talking about our articles, they'll sort of conveniently leave me out and just talk about Christian, but whatever. So we've basically just been hammering home our points and honing our arguments and developing our arguments, responding to objectors. So number 4, for example, is a response to various objections to our first paper that came out. There's a list of the rest of the papers. Some of these are on more sort of news websites like Rabble or Rewire. One of them's on my blog, but as I said, about half of them are on scientific journals. 6, you can hardly see that one, but 6 is an article by me writing about a Canadian case where, I don't know if you heard about this, but a couple of years ago, the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons passed a new policy amidst a huge public debate and lots of angry submissions from the anti-choice movement, requiring doctors to make an effective referral if they object to care for personal or religious reasons. So there's 2 Christian medical associations and I think 5 individual doctors who are suing the college because they refuse to make a referral. And actually, I found references in the anti-choice press that these doctors and these groups are even against having to. Part of the policy also requires them to provide urgent care when necessary if there's not another doctor to do it. So they're even against that. They don't want to provide emergency care. So it goes back to my claim, or not my claim, the idea, the fact that some doctors will just let women die. They don't care. Article 8 is our article about Sweden, Finland, and Iceland, showing that it can work to ban it. It's funny, when the very first draft of that article, I just facetiously threw that title on, "Yes, we can," and it just kind of stuck all the way through and got published that way. So we've also been presenting at various conferences and symposiums around the world at many different venues. FIGO is the International Federation of Gynecologists and Obstetricians. Christian has presented there on CO. FIAPAC, which is a French name. The English translation is International Federation of Professional Abortion and Contraception Associates. So they have conferences every 2 years, and I've been to many of those conferences, and there's usually at least one session on CO by one or both of us, because Christian is on the board, and he's a past president of FIAPAC, so he's a little bit of an in there. And then this is me talking at the International Congress on Women's Health and Unsafe Abortion in Thailand last January 2016. And then we've also presented together at the European Society of Contraception in Lisbon, Portugal, and more venues as well. I don't even know all the ones that Christian has done on his own. And of course, I'm doing some of my own, like here today, and to other groups as well. So there was an amazing event in Montevideo, Uruguay, just this past August. It was the first international convention on conscientious objection. So there's been regional meetings before, but never an international conference just on this topic. So they invited 50 experts from 20 countries, including policymakers, academics, health professionals, legal experts, and feminist activists. Unfortunately, I did not get an invitation. Christian did. That's Christian there. He's the bald guy wearing headphones and the light-colored jacket. And I tried to finagle an invitation. I really, really tried. And Christian sort of intervened for me as well, but unfortunately it didn't happen. But anyway, he went down there by himself, and I helped him and fed him all kinds of information and advice about what to say in each session, and it went really well. So reports about the meeting afterwards featured our point of view quite prominently. And so I think he did a great job at putting our views on the table. Of course, some people there already agreed with our point of view, but others didn't. But by the end of the meeting, at least according to him, he said that everyone except a couple people from Catholics for Choice were agreeing with our views. So Catholics for Choice is one of the. I mean, they're a great organization. They're pro-choice and they fight for liberal values. But on this issue, they're pretty stubborn and committed to protecting doctors' right to DD, and we don't really understand it. I've actually had debates with John O'Brien, who's the head of Catholics for Choice, and he's, it's like arguing with a religious believer. It is, yeah. You can't reach them. It's really frustrating. And I mean, like, I think they don't even read our articles. It's like, I don't know, they're afraid of the cognitive dissonance or something. I don't know. There was one other, there's only one Canadian at that meeting who was invited, and he's also an interesting guy, Dr. Udo Schucklink, not a medical doctor. He's a professor of bioethics at Queen's University in Kingston. And I've never actually met the guy, but we've emailed before, and he's been out there for many years, basically saying that CO is wrong, shouldn't be allowed in healthcare at all, any healthcare. And but his arguments are from a bioethical, philosophical framework, and whereas we've been publishing more in the medical journal, so it's a little bit different. But he's kind of going on claiming, well, I've already made all these arguments, and I started all this. Maybe it's true. So this comes from the organizer's statement after the conference, which was widely published. And remember, this is an international conference. The experts have concluded that the refusal to provide legal abortion services is hurting women all over the world and must be tackled. The group highlighted that conscientious objection in relation to health services is not supported by international human rights frameworks. Like, it's not in any law or a human rights code. The practice is sometimes allowed by national law, but it increasingly stigmatizes a fundamental health service and pushes women to carry a risky or unintended pregnancy to term. The participants agreed to individually further legal, ethical, health, and policy objectives that can mitigate the damaging effects of conscientious objection and reduce the immense burden on women who seek a legal professional service that must be rendered without prejudice. So, I mean, they didn't come right out and say that, we have to ban it, but they did come out with these very, very strong statements, highlighting all the harms and how it needs to be stopped, and there was nothing about CO being a right or a good thing or anything like that. So we were very happy with that. So a big part of our webpage, the conscientious-objection.info page, hope you'll visit it, is we have a whole page of victims of CO, DD. So these are defined as women who die or suffer serious injury or injustice because of being refused a legal abortion. So right now there's 44 victims and counting, and actually I've been doing this work, and I actually have like 3 or 4 more stories I still need to add to the site, so there's close to 50. And I just want to stress, maybe that doesn't sound like a lot, but these are only cases where a woman dies and it hits the papers, or a woman or her family sues and it hits the papers. So only cases that actually get media coverage. And so I think for every story we hear about in the news, there's, at least maybe hundreds more that we never hear about. So it's really on the tip of the iceberg. And you might notice at the very bottom, there's a sort of a mishmash of stories of 17 women from the USA. So the US is one of the worst offenders in terms of harming women from the exercise of DD. And there's a few other more detailed stories from the US up there, so I think there's like almost half of them are from the US. Many from Latin America. And a lot of these we found by, we did English language searches, but we decided to do foreign language searches as well. So we captured stories that maybe weren't in the English language press. And so it was hard to find people to help with that. I ended up doing a lot of work in Google Translate, but I found a lot of the stories from Latin America and Spain, and it was really quite, it's actually heartbreaking to do that project, to be reading these stories. It was really bad, upsetting. So I want to talk a little bit about these two in particular. First of all, we're doing a documentary film. Christian Fiala is actually, in addition to being an abortion provider, he's a PhD researcher at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. He's a founder and operator of a world renowned award-winning museum called the Museum of Contraception and Abortion in Vienna. And he does documentary films. So he's this really amazing, high accomplishing individual. So he's already done 2 films, and this is his 3rd. These are like smaller independent films will be shown at film festivals and things like that, so not for general release. But they've been getting, his previous films have been getting very good reviews. So Christian is actually well known for this saying. It was quoted actually in a journal that I picked this out of. You know how abortion laws often say, well, you can only have a legal abortion if your life is at risk. And same with something, you know, conscientious objection laws, like when you say, you have to provide an abortion in an emergency situation when the woman's life is at risk. Well, what does that even mean? It's very relative. How does the doctor decide when her life is at risk? And he nails it on the head. There's only one way to be sure a woman's life is at risk. That is after she dies. Because he's had experience with this. Like he worked in Africa, and you have a committee of doctors arguing about whether this woman's at risk of dying. And while everyone's arguing, nothing gets done, and then she dies. So the woman on the left, Savita Halappanavar, you may have heard of her, is a very famous case. She died in Ireland 5 years ago now, almost exactly. And what happened was, this is a bit of a tricky case, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit. Hopefully I have time here. Yes, what we're doing with the film is we're interviewing women and their families, their lawyers, other people who are involved in the cases. So we've done extensive interviews with Valentina's family in Italy and her lawyer, and I've actually been working on the film as well, and I've just finished helping set up a bunch of interviews with people involved in Savita's care and death. So that's been a very interesting project to work on, and the interviews will be taking place actually in a few days. So what happened with Savita is that Irish law, at the time that she died, Irish law basically said that abortion is illegal if there's a real and imminent risk to the woman's life, or in cases of where the woman is at risk of suicide. So a lot of people are saying, like, we've had some objections to including Savita on our list, because people are saying, well, she didn't die because of COs, because of the Irish law. But we actually think otherwise, because, I mean, it was technically legal for the doctor to provide her an abortion. What happened was she was miscarrying at 17 weeks. Her membranes ruptured, which kind of means like your water breaks, right, early. And, of course, there's no chance at that point for the fetus to survive. It's a doomed pregnancy, no hope. So the normal standard of care for pretty much any hospital in the world, immediate termination. Why? Because there's a very strong risk of infection, and particularly sepsis, which is a very rapid and life-threatening infection that can kill within hours. And the standard of care for sepsis in general across the world is you prevent it. You don't let it happen, you prevent it. But no, what happened with Savita is her doctor took a very conservative view of the law, and basically waited, refused. She and her husband asked repeatedly for a termination. She was refused. The doctor said, although later denied, but the doctor said, this is a Catholic country, we don't do that here. Also cited the law. And she was a Hindu immigrant from India, and along with her husband. Well-educated, professional. She was a dentist. And it was her first child, very much a wanted pregnancy. So anyway, she finally started to get sick. She already had signs of infection fairly early on, just shortly after she was admitted to the hospital. But what we found, and I recently really researched the case, I read a book about it, and there was just a litany of errors in her case. The inquest, or the public inquiry, put it down, they called it medical misadventure, because there was so many mistakes in her care by multiple healthcare personnel, but many of them were made by her doctor. And I looked at all these mistakes and I thought, how is this even possible? How can mistakes of this magnitude be made? And we're talking about, she didn't monitor Savita properly, delays in her care, missing obvious signs of infection. Another doctor, even a midwife, had earlier suspected that she was septic, had sepsis, but her own doctor didn't even see those signs. And I thought, well, how is that possible? And I kind of thought, maybe, she claimed that she was only just obeying the law, right? That's what she testified later at the inquest. But was she really, or what did her personal beliefs have something to do with it? And when I was setting up the interviews, there was a friend who happened to be a doctor, a friend of Savita and her husband Praveen. He was at the hospital when she died, and just helping Praveen, and I helped them afterwards in the next few days. And we have an interview set up with him for our documentary, and he said, I think the doctor was acting on her religious beliefs. It was more than just CO. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how those interviews happen. But we do think that there is something there that needs to be uncovered, and a lot of people, like Praveen, the widow, he was really brave. He went to the media. He actually enlisted the help of a pro-choice group in Ireland, went to the media. And his basic question throughout was, why? Why did this happen? Like in a modern country like Ireland, my wife died from this medical negligence. Why? But all he ever got were, this happened at such and such a time. We checked her blood. Blah, blah. So all the technicalities and the mistakes were kind of documented, but there was never an answer to the question of why, and that's what he wanted to know. So hopefully our documentary will help uncover a bit of that. Unfortunately, we couldn't get him to agree to be interviewed, but he lives in California now. Oh, he did, Praveen, the widower, he sued the hospital and Savita's doctor afterwards. The settlement was not made public, but reportedly he got a 6-figure settlement, possibly almost as close, almost 1 million euros. So I think that's really good. But I still think he never got the answer to his question why she died. So the next case I want to talk about a little bit is Valentina Meluzzo from Italy. Very, very similar, eerily similar to what happened to Savita. Now, in Valentina's case, it was really quite a clear case of conscientious objection. The doctor said he was an objector. What happened was she was carrying twins, again, a much wanted pregnancy. She actually had them implanted by that process. Yes, thank you. And but again, 19 weeks, she started miscarrying. Went to the hospital. She was actually there for almost 2 weeks before she started to show signs of infection. Of course, doctors were refusing to terminate. One of the fetuses died in utero while she was in the hospital. They refused to remove it or remove the other fetus because it still had a heartbeat. And so, of course, that's like very ripe grounds for infection right there. And it was really quite horrible. Sepsis is, as I said, it's a very rapid and life-threatening infection. She started to get really sick, and it actually just eats up your organs. It's horrible, and it's extremely painful. She was in agony for the last day of her life, and the doctors wouldn't do anything for her. They said they just dismissed her pain as labor pains. They were very disrespectful to her. They could have sent in for another doctor to do the termination, but they didn't. Her parents were there with her. They were just horrified, begging them to please do a termination and help them, give her some pain relief at least. They wouldn't. She was in such pain and so exhausted that she was begging to be put to sleep after a while. And finally, the other fetus died, and then they did the termination. But by then it was too late, and she died a few hours later. So again, the family is suing. And the hospital put out just a horrible report, a quick kind of whitewashing report afterwards, claiming it wasn't CO. And they did the same thing as in the Savita case. It was very similar. Like they just sort of documented all the things that happened, minute by minute, hour by hour, and mistakes were made, And so really it was just like the cause of the death was lack of communication, and we forgot to check her, or all this litany of errors. But never admitting that they should have immediately performed the termination as soon as she arrived at the hospital 2 weeks previously. Or at least, the day before she got really sick. So it's just very, very upsetting. And on that list of victims that I showed you, not too many of the women had died. I think about 4 or 5 on that list. But some others suffered really serious injustices or mistreatment. And I wanted to give you an example of this one. I can't really see it very well, but it says... she survived. This is Paula from Spain. Paula's not her real name. And she said that what the doctors did almost cost her life. So what happened was, and this made the news because she sued them and she got a settlement of 270,000 euros. So the hospital, in Spain, abortion is legal, and it's supposed to be provided in public hospitals or accredited facilities. In practice, though, it's generally 90% of women end up being referred to private clinics. So private clinics take the main load of abortion patients. In some regions in Spain, you can't get an abortion at a public hospital at all. They just refer. This also causes women delays, and often they have to drive a long distance. That's kind of what happened to Paula here. So she learned that she was carrying, her fetus had a fatal anomaly 7 months into the pregnancy, and it took that long because there were some errors during her antenatal diagnosis. Now, I don't know exactly what happened there, but I just wanted to mention the possibility that, doctors, anti-choice doctors don't like doing these prenatal diagnoses in case of fetal anomaly because they're worried that the woman might go for an abortion. So they will delay or refuse tests and things like that. So I'm wondering if something like that happened here. So she couldn't find anyone to terminate the pregnancy in her hometown or any nearby public hospital. Eventually, the public health service said, okay, we need to respect, the doctor's right to objection on moral grounds, but we'll pay for the termination at a private clinic in Madrid. So by this time, she was 32 weeks pregnant. The trip was 570 kilometers away. She went by car with her partner, so the hospital didn't even take her in an ambulance. She'd already been having some pains for days, and the hospital told her it was just wind. They just dismissed it. But in fact, the pain was due to an irregularity in her uterus, which was affected by the pregnancy. So by the time she arrived at the clinic in Madrid, she was bleeding heavily and lost a lot of blood, had to be transferred to the hospital for an emergency cesarean section to remove the fetus, which died almost immediately afterwards. And then they had to remove her uterus to stop the bleeding. And this is a very young woman, and she can't have any more kids. And there was reports like this happened a few years ago, 2012, I think. And she's still it had major psychological effects on her as well, left her depressed for years, and it was really awful what they did to her. So that's just one example of many of the stories on our site. And you can see why I would get really upset when I was researching these stories. It was awful. So the last thing I want to mention in terms of what we're doing to try and stop the exercise of DD is we both of us just got an invitation, Christian and I, to give oral evidence at the UK Parliament. Yay! So it's the 50th anniversary of the UK Abortion Act that was passed in '67, and I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that that act was the very first time that CO was codified in law by any country. So we're going to give oral evidence at a committee hearing, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Population, Development, and Reproductive Health. This is a long acronym that they use. So basically, we had made a written submission to them, and apparently they liked it. So the submission was on CO and how UK as the initial country to put CO into law is in a fantastic opportunity to now play a leading role and set an example for the world by repealing the CO clause in their law. Although actually what we also want them to do, preferably, is repeal the entire law, because they don't need a law on abortion at all. Like Canada doesn't have a law against abortion, and we encourage countries to follow our example. And actually, I have testified at the UK Parliament before, oddly enough, in 2008, on the topic of Canada having no law. I think at the time the UK was, they go through these perennial debates every few years of trying to reduce the time limit for abortion. So it was around that. And so I've asked permission this time to also briefly talk about why they should repeal the law and why no law is necessary based on Canada's example. So overall, we're very encouraged by, it seems like we're making progress, and we are shifting the framework to some extent on CO and its acceptability. There's still some people in our movement, or activist colleagues and doctors who we're still kind of they're stubbornly arguing with us still, or not really dealing with our arguments, but we're working on them. And so I think I'm just very encouraged and excited that we have been making this progress, and it feels good as an activist to be able to see that we're making a difference and kind of impacting the public debate on this issue. So, and that's it. And that kind of sums up, it's abortion is healthcare. Healthcare is a right. Deliver that healthcare. Stop refusing. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.